Thanks for joining us on probably the nicest day of the year. And this is the weather has come to Ithaca to celebrate the presence of Tom Lamarre. And for me, it's always exhilarating to welcome back a colleague and friend for whom Cornell has been such a home. It was back in 1995. That's 25 years ago, Tom. And Tom spent a year at Cornell as a fellow of the Society for the Humanities that I first came to appreciate his vast erudition and exceptional critical acuity. It was then in a year-long reading group on Gilles Deleuze with Naoki Sakai. Remember that, Naoki?
Yes.
Film philosopher David Roderick, who's now Tom's colleague at Chicago, who is also a fellow, Brett DeBerry, myself, and a few of our graduate students. Tom dazzled us with his exceptional nose for the close reading of Deleuze's challenging text, Difference and Repetition, which was enhanced by Tom's learned comfort with mathematics, which eluded all of us. Then began a journey that included a short stay on the Cornell faculty of Asian Studies, when he introduced us to the nuances of his ongoing work on Japanese animation technologies and downloading piracy. And when I relished his presence as a close neighbor, meaning he actually lived about 3 miles down the road from me. And we've since enjoyed Tom's return visits to lecture at Cornell a couple of other times, and are extremely thankful for his willingness to spend the afternoon with our EastAsia Plus collective, which is highlighted by this afternoon's capstone lecture. We've been working together all afternoon on thinking about really interesting manifold publishing projects. Thinking conceptually across interdisciplinary platforms comes so naturally for Tom that we jumped at the chance to invite him for our May inaugural workshop of EastAsia Plus. Thomas Lamarre comes to us as Professor of Cinema and Media Studies and East Asian Languages and Civilizations at the University of Chicago, and as the James McGill Professor Emeritus of Japanese Media Studies at McGill University, where he spent most of his career and where he continues to work with the Moving Image Research Laboratory funded by the Canadian Foundation for Innovation. Tom's intellectual range and interdisciplinary ambition are legendary and so exemplary of the expectations we have for EastAsia Plus. His extraordinary books range from historical analysis of the communication networks of 9th century Japan, I said 9th, in uncovering Heian Japan, an archaeology of sensation and inscription, 2000. Then there are the theoretical reflections on silent cinema and the global imaginary and shadows on the screen, Tanizaki Junichiro on cinema and oriental aesthetics, 2005. His groundbreaking conceptual thinking on animation technologies and the extraordinary book, The Anime Machine, A Media Theory of Animation, which was 2009, and extensive analysis of television infrastructures and media ecologies in the Anime Ecology, a genealogy of television, animation, and game media, which came out a couple of years ago in 2018. His work includes major translations of works from Japanese and French, and exceptional edited volumes on cinema and animation, on the impact of modernity in East Asia, on preemptive war, Journal of Sites, and formerly as associate editor of Macadamia, an annual forum for anime, manga, and fan arts, a number of volumes on manga, anime, and fan cultures. He's co-editor with Tayuki Tatsumi of the University of Minnesota Press book series Parallel Futures, which centers on Japanese speculative fiction. And his current editorial work includes a co-edited volume on Chinese animation with Daisy Yandu, and a co-edited volume on digital animalities with Jody Berland. I might also mention his extraordinarily subtle essay on Xubing, which he wrote for my Chinese collection on the artist series Background Stories. And thanks, Tom, for that. But rather than rely on my further accolades, I now invite you to enjoy the luminous screen presence of my cherished colleague and friend, Tom Lamarre, who will speak to us on the topic, Infrastructure and Sensibility, a Physiology of Power. So thanks so much, Tom, and you can take it from here.
Thank you, Tim. That was one of the nicest and longest introductions I've ever received. And It's always really wonderful to be back at Cornell. I really enjoy the discussions I've had with everyone, and I look forward to more today. I'm going to begin by sharing the screen. And all good? Okay, so let me also first thank Andrea Bachner for inviting me to speak today, and also Emily McDonald and Josh Young for their organizational efforts. And I do want to begin with a land acknowledgement. The University of Chicago occupies the homelands of the Council of Three Fires, the Odawa, Ojibwe, and the Potawatomi. Nations including the Ho-Chunk Miami, Menominee, Sac, and Fox also steward these lands and waterways for generations. Despite centuries of ongoing colonial violence, tens of thousands of indigenous peoples continue to call this territory home. I also want to mention that the increased use of land acknowledgements as email signatures reminds us of a certain gap or interval. For instance, I receive constant email reminders from colleagues at McGill through infrastructural distribution that McGill University is situated on unceded Indigenous lands in Montreal, a place that has long served as a site of meeting exchange for Indigenous peoples. The Mohawk are recognized as the traditional custodians of these lands and waters. Now, I want to express my gratitude here to the Digital Media Workshop at University of Chicago, especially Avery Laflamme and Gary Kaffer, for the reminder that when we gather this way remotely, our recourse to telecommunications makes it more difficult to pinpoint specific histories. We might consider, for instance, where fiber optic cables are laid, how this platform Zoom depends on a global network of high emission centers. And as we know, the benefits and risks of these infrastructures are unevenly distributed. And this actually brings me to the topic of my talk today, my approach to infrastructures. Land acknowledgements bring us directly into the problematic. It's not the brute fact of our occupation of indigenous territories that is the problem, or not only. It's the sensibility that accompanies that occupation, which is mediated by infrastructures that are distributed in specific ways. There's a powerful current within media studies that is dedicated to exposing the material underpinnings of infrastructures that remain largely invisible to users. Nicole Starosielski's work on undersea cables and Deborah Cowan's works on logistics are excellent examples. Such work leads us towards questions of sensibility, but do not broach them directly. Starosielski shows how massively distributed and environmentally destructive networks of undersea cables become sensible to users in the form of time lag, for instance. But still, sensibility is not the focus of our study. And so an inverse and complementary line of inquiry is needed, I think. We need to ask how do massively distributed infrastructures, not just the undersea cables, but the entire set of arrays and arrangements affect sensibility. Now, there are already ways of dealing with this problem. One focuses a great deal on modernity and the formation of modern subjectivity. I'm thinking of Brian Larkin, for instance, who calls attention to symbolics and poetics of infrastructures, which stand for such ideals as progress and enlightenment. John Durham Peters reminds us that the other side of these ideals is precisely the modern experiences of lonely and uncertainty. Do telecommunications networks really put us more in touch with one another, or simply create more uncertainty about our connections? Television, needless to say, complicates these approaches in interesting ways, and not least because its contents are not so easily reduced to media structures or infrastructures. The question of sensibility is considerably complicated by televisual forms of content and forms of expression, as well as social demographics. I should mention that I'm mostly today looking specifically at television animation, which is in itself a vast and unruly set of materials. But in this context, it's impossible to rest content with exposing the materiality and destructiveness of infrastructure, or with confining sensibility to questions of modernity as a technological condition, for instance. Nonetheless, this question of infrastructures, how they affect sensibility, remains an important one, precisely in its daunting complexity. And that's the question that I propose to take a closer look at today, drawing on the famous, or perhaps notorious, Pokémon incident, which has strangely enough largely been ignored both in media studies and in Japan studies. The Pokémon incident occurred on December 16th, 1997, when the 38th episode of the Pokémon animated television series Den no Senshi Porygon provoked photosensitive epileptic seizures across Japan. The Pokémon franchise had enjoyed phenomenal popularity from the launch of its handheld console Nintendo game in 1996, and had already expanded its base with the serialization of a Pokémon manga and the popular monthly magazine for children, Koro Koro Komiku. The debut of the animated series on April 1st, 1977, spurred this franchise to new heights of popularity. So by the time this episode went on air, the animated series had hit its stride with a very distinctive look and feel, a recognizable set of characters, and a growing collection of brand products, manga, card games, foodstuff, figures, and other toys. The broadcaster TV Tokyo aired the show in 27 prefectures in Japan, predicting that approximately 10 million people would watch it, over 7 million of whom would be school children. The estimate, of course, is based on the show's ratings, which at over 15% were the highest in its time slot. At about 6:50 p.m., however, roughly 2/3 of the way into the episode, a large number of viewers, especially children between the ages of 6 and 12, experienced headaches, nausea, blurring of vision, convulsion, and other symptoms characteristic of photosensitivity. By 7:30 p.m., 618 children were taken to hospitals, and as word spread, several television stations replayed the flash sequence, which may have triggered additional cases. Eventually, the Fire and Disaster Management Agency reported 685 children rushed to hospitals and seen by physicians. So this is the official account of what's called Pokémon shock. It generally cited in news reports as about 700 children. But actually, in addition to this core group of children whose cases were reported, subsequent surveys by doctors indicate that large numbers of children experienced symptoms of neurological distress, running a broad gamut of symptoms. So the affected population was much higher. Some reports calculate, because statistical analysis showed about 5% of viewers experienced this distress, even a conservative estimate would put the number of affected children close to 100,000. So it's easy to understand why the Pokémon incident is so widely cited in neuroscientific literature on the impact of television. It's as if broadcasters had prepared a randomized clinical trial of neurophysiological effects of television on an exceeding large population of viewers. Indeed, the sheer number of viewers offers a data set large enough for variations to be accounted for with some degree of statistical accuracy. What's more, the cause for the generated effects seem to be relatively easy to isolate with a fairly high degree of confidence. That is, this animation was credited with a 12 hertz red-blue flicker, which is supposed to affect children of a certain age. So it seems there's a satisfactory causal explanation. Incidentally, this causal explanation was arrived at without any scientific experimentation. It was actually government officials and others who came up with it. And we'll see why this is problematic. In any case, the real concern was to get Pokémon back on the air. So as you see here in this image of Yamada Miyuki, by April 16th, 1998, to bring the show back on air, she explained the situation to viewers. And she's talking about the kinds of things that had to happen, that broadcasters, scientists, and government had to work together to figure out what was going on to introduce new policies. So among these policies are some that are very familiar to us now. If you watch anime, for instance, you notice these warnings telling you not to get too close to the television and also to keep the lights on when you watch it. But there's also other kinds of devices used. For instance, you have to run animated television shows through an actual computer program that will show you what kinds of frequencies you're producing through broadcast. So it's worthwhile noting here that the 12 hertz red-blue flicker was not due to animation or the broadcast frequency, but to both. In other words, it's a distributed infrastructural effect, as we'll see, that cannot be reduced to any particular medium. So the overall response then to my thinking, and this was my initial entry into this research, is to think of it as a kind of Foucauldian dispositif, as an apparatus or paradigm. That is, it seems that we're having a holding together of different techniques or measurement or spacing to produce a power knowledge formation. And this is fairly novel, right? Suddenly animators are talking to broadcasters, are talking to the government, are talking to scientists and telling families what to do, who are in turn telling government and broadcasters what to do. So suddenly television animation is at the center of this kind of apparatus. But my real question is then, how do we characterize this? Like, what kind of power is this? If we can call it a dispositif, what in particular does it affect in terms of knowledge and power? Now, one of the first things that's interesting to me about this is that the policies and other responses to the Pokémon incident did not treat it as a sociological problem or a psychological problem, which have been the usual ways of talking about the effects of television. As we know, there's long histories of discourses in which television is thought of in these terms precisely as psychological or sociological. But here suddenly we have the shift to something new. And in the scientific literature, in particular neuroscientific studies, it has become associated above all with neurophysiological addiction. So this new kind of power formation is being organized around discourses on addiction. Now, of course, addiction is, if anything, very culturally determined. There are social parameters for what counts as addiction, but this is precisely what begins to drop out of this kind of apparatus. It's very much based on the sense that there is a direct physiological effect of media on brains and on bodies. So I think we can still read this move in Foucauldian terms. At stake is a kind of physiology of power. Power is not, if you will, merely ideological in the sense of ideas or discourses. These discourses are coupled with the transformation of a body, a somaticization, as Foucault once put it. There's some kind of architecture of visibilities with physiological effects. And I would add here, because I'll talk more about it at length later, that addiction always implies a kind of apparatus inciting techniques that combine work on self or care for self. That is, addiction is always treated as a problem of the individual or largely as a problem, and individuals have to learn how to take care of themselves and how to take certain measures to actually make themselves functional. So in other words, the question for me when I was first looking at Pokémon incident is, why did I turn to media ecology at all? Doesn't Foucault's theory of dispositif already offer satisfactory explanation or intervention when we try to understand these infrastructural effects? And my answer eventually turned out to be yes. In many ways, Foucault's approach is very satisfactory. And at the same time, no, in the sense that the techniques or practices of self discussed by Foucault largely concern modes of human existence. They really are focused on the human. And the problem of technology is situated in a way that doesn't quite let us get a full sense of the non-human beings, the actants or agents that are playing a key role in this incident. And those are precisely what I want to bring out by turning to an account of media ecology. So to turn to media ecology, I want to first note that if we look at these groups that are brought together through the Pokémon incident, that there are different interests and problems here. But I want to focus specifically on the scientific literature because it's here you really see the physiology of power developing that both exceeds the event, that is, this is widely cited in the literature even today. It's the most common point of reference in scientific literature, and at the same time seems to organize the way in which these other kinds of measurements interact. So what's worthwhile noting about the scientific literature is the mysteries that multiply. First of all, when the scientific literature looks at the animation itself, at the Pokémon animation, we discovered that the kinds of forms that can produce the effect multiplied. That is, we couldn't just attribute it to this particular scene, all this seemed to be the strongest trigger. Suddenly they found that effects like this could produce photosensitive responses and even images like this. And they also found as audiences were more frightened by certain kinds of images, it tended to trigger the effect as well. In other words, you get to a broad spectrum of effects where even narrative comes into play and you can no longer localize the effect in a singular or one kind of animation form. So the same thing happens with the screen. The deeper the studies go, the kinds of television screen that could produce the effect continue to multiply. Initially, it would seem to be obviously a problem of the CRT screen and broadcasting. That is this sort of effect of interlacing you get with cathode ray tube technology. But in fact, as people look closer, it turned out that plasma TV could produce these effects. And finally, of course, liquid crystal TV, which is the most common today. The same thing happens at the level of platforms. The kinds of platforms that could produce the effect also multiplied. Again, we begin with the cathode ray tube television set, but of course, the same kind of technology was used for computers at the time. So computers produced this effect. But then as scientists look deeper, they've discovered that, in fact, Nintendo Game Boys were producing this effect, actually with different forms of animation than the 12 Hz flash. And there was a wide range of adolescents who were already experimenting with making themselves black out by producing epileptic seizures with their Game Boys. You also found that arcade games could produce this effect under certain circumstances. And finally, of course, our old friend, the cell phone. So as you move along through these studies, what happens is when you get eventually to audience, the kinds of persons affected, this too continued to change and multiply. It's a fairly reasonable bet with the initial Pokémon incident that children ages 6 to 12 were the most affected because they are the most photosensitive. But as scientists looked at this, they suddenly discovered new syndromes, adult syndromes, adolescent syndromes, and a whole population of people who had never had any propensity to photosensitive seizures who suddenly could experience these effects. So what's the upshot of this? The upshot is that the scientific studies imply a singularity. We can't find a single cause. The cause is distributed in space and time. And the further we try to get back to the origin, all we're going to find is this warping and twisting of space and time itself. The human user, the media platform, the animation form, or if you will, wetware, hardware, and software, are brought into relation through the singularity. There's a kind of energy cascade. So as long as you have a certain set of relations between these, this form of energy is channeled through the system and in itself distributed. We can also see that in this way, there are two registers of relation at play in these kinds of incidents. First, there's the interaction in the register of individuals. We can talk about the human, the platform, and the animation form as individual players. But at the same time, there's some kind of interaction in the register of the infra-individual. That is, there's some kind of singularity that doesn't limit this effect to specific individuals, but only to certain kinds of configurations that are not identifiable at the level of interaction. So this brings me to the question of platformativity. So I'm thinking about platformativity here in a fairly simplistic way, and I'm building obviously off of Judith Butler's famous account of performativity, but really trying to think about what kind of performativity arises when you actually have three agents or three actors involved in the process. Here we can diagram it very simply. We can think, for instance, of the platform as a kind of medium, the contents maybe as message, and there's a set of interactions between all three of these actants, the user, human user, platform, and contents. And we can think about these kinds of interactions quite literally. In the Pokémon incident, again, these images make me laugh a little bit. You can ask me why I chose them, and it's a bit random. But again, we can think in terms of a CRT TV set, the animation form, and then this putative child viewer watching the animation. And we can identify all these as individuals and study them. But what we actually discover, and this is the physiology of power, that something else is going on that can't be attributed to any single one of these individuals in isolation, but only on the overall situation. We can also expand this model to think of, to give another example, cell phones and different kinds of locations, different sets of users, different kinds of content. And I say this not so much to imply that performativity is just a structure, but it really is an infrastructural effect. That is, it's something that is becoming prior to structure, and it can't be understood in terms of the history of structure, but more in, I think, what we might call a genealogy. And this is because there are these interactions taking place contents and users. And I'll simply diagram it simply in this way. We have two registers of interaction. That is, on the one hand, we have interactions between these individuals, and then we have something like a milieu. We have interactions or infra-individual relations that seem to be what is actually producing the effect. So I think in this way, we can shift from an analysis of an apparatus or a dispositif and think more about media ecology, because we're now dealing with a kind of milieu that certainly has a history, but it's not a continuous history. And it certainly has a place, but its place is not necessarily a set of spatial coordinates. And so I want to summarize a little bit to draw some of the implications of what I've talked about so far and potentially to prepare some questions. First of all, we could say that in this apparatus, the relation of self to self and self to other cannot be extricated from this platformative situation. I characterize this as ontopower, insofar as it's characterized by the production and productive power of non-human beings or mode of existence, by which I mean literally characters, media contents become actors as well as platforms, and they act as different kinds of actors. Their power cannot be reduced to one another. And this poses a certain kind of challenge for us, I think, within humanities, because usually we split the work here. Media studies deals with relation between humans and platforms, and then humanities or studies deal with the relationship between humans and content. But in fact, we need to look at all three of these things simultaneously. And to characterize this as the media ecology, I also want to say the domain of ontopower is not homeostatic feedback nor autopoiesis. The interaction between these actors is not simply a cybernetic looping or a cybernetic feedback system. It is, in the full sense, an ecology, insofar it is capable of certain kinds of transformation and a kind of heterogeneity capture. So this brings me to my last part, which is the end, in fact, to return to the question of sensibility. I think when we begin to look at infrastructures in this way, that is, in terms of this double level of the infra-individual and the inter-individual, we begin to think about three principles for a transductive understanding of these platformative situations. The first is semblance. A platform and a character and a human do not resemble one another, and yet through platformativity, they bear a semblance to one another. That is, humans somehow begin to feel like platforms, characters begin to feel like platforms, but also platforms begin to feel like humans and possibly characters. This enhances a mode that I borrow from 1950s television studies of parasociality, that although the relationship between the three individuals may not be directly social, it implies a kind of parasociality in which they all seem to be on the same level. That is, suddenly the platform seems like it could be a social relation. The character feels like it could be a social relation, and possibly, although we don't know, perhaps the character is a social relation for the platform. And finally, amodality. None of these modes really pass through one single modal form of perception. That is, it doesn't reduce itself to the study of sound or the study of sight or even to the study of touch. There's most of these effects are taking place across modalities in haptic modes, in modes in which seeing is like hearing, hearing like seeing, or even touching, which is the most common effect now with cell phones, becomes a way of understanding both seeing and hearing. So I want to set those out, partly in a provocative way to provoke questions, but also to come back to this question of sensibility. I think that these three principles provide us a way to understand the milieu for these kinds of media situations, possibly in a genealogical fashion. But they also make clear what kinds of tensions are introduced through infrastructures. There's a lot of detail to go into here, and I want to note that I didn't actually directly talk about infrastructure at all, but only about the way infrastructure appears as a kind of infra-individual effect. It would be difficult to speak then of an overarching sensibility, but if there is an overarching sensibility to begin with, at least in the content that I worked on, that is Japanese television animation, it's a kind of sensibility in keeping with platformativity. We see a fascination with animism, a fascination with the coming to life of characters, of humans and platforms individually and together. It develops a milieu in which everything seems to be a person, even if everything is not a human. And so in a strange way, this kind of media animism brings us back to the techniques of sovereignty associated with indigenous political movements. But it forces us into a reconsideration of what it would actually mean to take sides with indigenous movements through something like media animism. I don't think it is the same form of animism in other words. And so here I prefer to turn to the politics of the Wet'suwet'en protest, which is trying to prevent the construction of pipeline infrastructures in British Columbia. They ask us not to be in alliance with them, to pretend to be their friends, but simply to create trouble, what they call being in cahoots. So my question I would end with here, is there a way for media animism to actually be in cahoots with forms of indigenous animism? And I'll end there for questions.
Wow, thank you so much. That was really amazing. So we're going to go to question and answer. People can use the reactions raise hand function and I will call on you. Or you can write your question into chat if you would prefer me to read it out. So I'll open the floor now. Go ahead, Tim.
Thanks, Tom. That was really phenomenal. It got me thinking a little bit in relationship to platformativity, to a text that got a lot of attention in academic circles around the discussion of postmodernism, and I'm thinking of Jean-Francois Lyotard's Postmodern Condition, which at the time, this was a text written in the early 80s. And it was mainly celebrated, especially in North America, because there was an appendix to the English edition called What is Postmodernism? And Frederick Jameson wrote a foreword to the English edition, which was published by Minnesota, kind of focusing on that appendix. And what got completely lost in that was that this was a book that it was actually commissioned by the university or by the state of Quebec as a report on education. And what Lyotard did, which still I think is rather astonishing in this book and was almost completely overlooked, is he wrote a critique of technology as it had been inserted into systems of higher education, especially in the humanities, vis-a-vis the hegemony of performativity. And what his argument was the the gradual layering of performative infrastructures within the university as means of acceleration, of performance, of testing, of funding, of research grants, right, ended up dulling and compressing the expression of call it humanistic erudition. And in a way, this echoed a text that Martin Heidegger wrote along about 20, 30 years earlier. What is technology? And the question that I wanted to ask in this context, Tom, is how you understand this critique of performativity in relationship to what you're calling platformativity, and whether then the media animism that you're calling for could provide, how it might provide us with a discursive, if not pedagogical, if not research alternative to the system that continually weighs us down. Sorry about that.
Yeah, thank you, Tim. I mean, that's a really important and well-formulated question. And, you know, in effect, I think although I'm working through Foucault, I'm entirely in agreement with Lyotard on this point, right? That there is a way in which this form of knowledge is performative, but not necessarily in, as you say, a kind of good way, right? Like you can even think of media skills in these terms. When people make this claim about computer games all the time, or we make it about our children playing computer games, are they actually just addicted to video games, or are they learning skills they're going to use in the workforce later in life, right? And it becomes very hard to distinguish between being skilled at something and actually having a problem with your relation to it. And I think that the discourses on addiction that emerge around the Pokémon incident are posing that question in a very direct way. They're saying, in fact, when we're on media, we're working on ourselves. We're making ourselves into something for the workplace. At the same time, if we don't take care of ourselves, we are going down the rabbit hole of media. What's interesting about this, and again, I think Lyotard would agree, is that it puts a tremendous amount of pressure on the sovereignty, first of the individual, and then on the family, because if the individual fails, who's responsible? The family, right? So it's leading us back, I think, to a situation Foucault used to describe psychiatric power. Right? He literally said that psychiatric power is the form of power that functions where if you can't operate as a sane person functionally in society, the responsibility falls on your family. So the family is a mode of sovereignty that makes disciplinary power work, in other words. Something like that's happening here, right? Literally, you could say that the state is falling back on the family as a form of sovereignty. It's advocating its responsibility, placing it on parents to make everything function. So, and I would say the educational system can be added to that, right? So I think there's a really strong critique that can be made. So what does it mean, as you asked, to add the platform to this, right? Like how does that change our perspective? I mean, I think on the one hand, maybe again, just agreeing with Lyotard, it intensifies it because we can't think of education apart from these platforms anymore. Look at us now, right? Like the situation we're in. So you could say there's a new intensification of this very problem, but also I would argue, and this is where the animism comes in, that we can't really think of education only as a relation to a content. We know this. We're thinking about education in relation to platforms and infrastructures. And just the basic training on those particular media can stand in for content, right? So in that sense, I'm not like so much against what Lyotard's saying, but as you point out, really extending it and saying, suddenly we have a new kind of agency that we have to deal with. And it makes it difficult for us. I think it's a division of labor in the academy that media studies people will deal with the platforms, and then the humanists will deal more with the content of education. But without thinking platformativity, we can't really account for the kinds of transformations underway. Which raises the question of what resists. I mean, I'm always hesitant to write a talk like this from the standpoint of resistance. It's like I give an answer to a problem before the problem sinks in. But I think animism is, in a curious way, as in any form, if we think through Foucault, is a kind of resistance. Because when in a lot of the kinds of entertainments I look at, whether they be games or animations and others, there's a way in which damage and harm become the dominant affects to work through. In other words, there's a way in which I think players and viewers are become conscious of the infra-individual by trying to connect to each other through damage. So very few of these entertainments that is, oh, I like you and we're friends and we move on, but rather you have a wound, I have a wound, how do our wounds speak to one another? And I think it's there you see a couple of things, that media animism, if you want to push it, makes us think in terms of a negative commons. That what we hold in common is not something that's necessarily positive for us, but increasingly what we hold in common is something that is harmful to us. And that becomes more and more the basis for the way a kind of community or society is being imagined. So that's a very long response. And I hope it provokes more questions, but that is the basic answer.
Thanks, that's great.
Okay, I see a question from Mimi. So I'm going to read your question, Mimi, or do you want to read it?
I'll read it. Yeah,
Okay.
I'm happy to have the chance to get my thoughts together. And it's actually much longer, but I thought, that's crazy. I'll just stop here. So I really like the way that you're both opening and closing with this invitation to think productively, more seriously, farther about what it is we do when we do land acknowledgements. So I just wanted to thank you for that. My question is about, I guess it's about this word energy cascade and the relation to the three terms that you're introducing when you introduce this idea of platformativity. Because if you're talking about medium, message, and user, and saying that there's something that can't be attributed to any single one of them, but that there's this distributed agency, then is that the beginning of talking about more than three things? And like, why do we have to stop with three? And then if I had continued the, because it seems like an energy cascade is really not, it's hard to make into, it's hard to separate into these entities. So I was interested in the energy itself. And my perennial question with you, Tom, also is kind of whether you're being a little bit unfair to the humanities when you characterize us as people who are only interested in content. Because I wonder if we're not sort of, ultimately my fantasy is that environmental humanities or energy humanities or one of these new humanities can in fact be a happy umbrella term for all these things that we're talking about. But I'll stop there.
Yeah, thank you, Mimi. Three really great questions there. And you're right, I'm being unfair, and I shouldn't say humanities, I guess I should say area studies. Because, one of the questions one always gets when one does anything with media, or even worse, within area studies poses questions of knowledge and power, is people will complain that you don't read content very well. I get that complaint all the time. It's like, well, if you really read the content closely, none of it, kind of like the problems would disappear. So I think it's just sort of my a little bit off the cuff response more to area studies. I think humanities is moving in this way, but I still think it's a challenge, right? I mean, I don't find it easy, and I think I wrote a really difficult book because I still find it difficult to think both those things, which brings you to the second question when you're asking about energy cascade and more than three. First of all, definitely more than three. And was thinking about energy cascade in a very specific ecological way. And in some ways, it was my way of dealing with trends in environmental media studies. Environmental media studies tend to treat the milieu as an external environment, which really runs counter to ecology, because in ecology, you don't simply have an external environment in an organism. Rather, organisms within an ecology are linked to each other through a flow of energy. So organisms that never meet each other or ever have any sort of, if you will, face-to-face encounter actually are but it's not at the level of individuals. And that in ecology is normally called energy cascade. So I'm borrowing that language, right, to refer to the fact that there's a movement through the system that holds it together. There's a movement of something through the system that holds it together. I simply pause because my internet keeps sort of pausing. And we need to think in terms of that, in terms of milieu, rather than just the environment. So I like environmental media studies, quite frankly. I mean, I like Nicole Starosielski when she deals with undersea cables, but when you begin to ask questions about sensibility or subjectivity, there is a question of mediation. Like, it's not like the undersea cables, we experience them directly, and that forms a subjectivity. It's not deterministic. So you need a milieu. You need to understand this middle ground in some way that we understand our connection, and not just simply as this direct deterministic connection, that we immediately act on the cables or they on us. I think some of the other work in infrastructure studies that defines infrastructure in terms of when rather than where they are, like when they're accessed and activated, fits with this kind of notion. So yes, it can be more than 3, and it definitely would. My strategy for introducing 3 is in some ways to say, okay, there would be more. It's just, these are the actors, I think, that speak to our epistemology right now. Like, obviously, it doesn't really have to be limited to them. And that does lead to the first question you asked, which is about the land acknowledgement. And indeed, I think you put it really well, is that I think about the performativity of land acknowledgements, right? Like it's right. I mean, that's part of what it means to make an acknowledgement, is to think about what the hell we're doing in making it. Like, what gesture is this? And often people will say, and this is true, that it's showing we're on the side of a certain kind of politics, which is important. But again, as we're doing this more and more through platforms, it seems to me we have to consider the platformative dimension of this. And that's why I wanted to create this dialogue between this incredible explosion of interest in animism, in anthropology and media studies, with what I think of as, if you will, a real politics of animism associated with the indigenous. And I think these are not the same. So platformativity, I think, can help us to negotiate that and think through a little bit more seriously what we're performing, like where connections might be possible and maybe really are not possible, right? Like where media is not going to help us. So again, long-winded response, but that was a really great set of questions.
So I do have a question, but I don't want to.
Yeah, go ahead. Divya.
Okay, but Joshua has blacked me out. I have no idea why. So you can't see me. Joshua, can you put my image on?
We would love to see you, Livia.
Yeah,
There you go.
okay, but Joshua has blacked me. I have no idea why. Okay.
We see you.
Good. No, I bet you weren't able to see me. I have no idea why Joshua put me out. Anyway, so thank you so much, Tom, for a phenomenal talk there. We couldn't have expected anything else from you. I was listening to you talking about two different two different types of animism, and the question that you're mentioning the resistance to that pipeline in British Columbia, and there is overall a huge global movement of resistance. At the same time, it's being quashed and repressed and criminalized, and activists are being murdered, as you know, by the hundreds in Latin America and so on and so forth. But going back to the question of platformativity, which is a central concept in the anime ecology in your book. You mentioned semblance, you mentioned onto power, and you mentioned platformativity. You are pushing Brian Masumi's concepts further, and I was wondering, because he was not talking about media animism, he was talking about different. He was talking about semblance in the question of affect. So I was wondering about this question of platformativity. I'm not expecting you to give a final answer, because none of us can do that. And you are asking questions, you're through provocations, one after another. What I'm thinking of, Masumi defined onto power as neoliberal capitalism or global capitalism's hold, appropriation, manipulation of the very sense of life, what makes life livable, and what he called the surplus of life, right? So how do you think that platformativity can be transformed or harnessed as a counter onto power? Because, as you know very well, and thank you for mentioning the resistance in British Columbia and other places all over the world right now. We know in Dakota and so on and so forth. So do you think that the question that platformativity works at the level of the infra-individual? We're no longer talking about individual, we're talking about infra level, which is below the individual. Individual is already a different kind of individual. There's no longer any. So how can we harness this platformativity, which cannot be now, as you were mentioning, be separated from any kind of pedagogy? Even now, when we're talking through Zooms, do you see any way from instead what you call media animism? But this media animism, it is put to work in various indigenous resistance movements, but it is repurposed in cahoots, to use the word you used and the word they used, with their own types of animism, which are ancestral, and of course had no idea, had no notion of media animism when they started to be used maybe thousands of years ago. Sorry for a very long question. These are questions I pose to myself.
Yeah, they're important questions, and as I said, I don't have like neat answers to any of them. I guess I would begin perhaps with onto power, because as you say, I mean, it's something that Brian Masumi develops, and it's also something that Beth Povinelli develops in the context of Indigenous peoples in Australia. And her work made me think of a certain kind of question about onto power. That is it possible to treat an ecosystem as an individual, as it is in myth, right? And she'll talk about Tijapel and the fact that a whole range of entities are not separated into a stream and a human and trees, for instance, but function under one rubric as a mythically coherent entity. So what would it mean to give status to that kind of individual, right? To something like an ecology. We do things like that already in media, strangely enough. I mean, characters have legal status. Corporations have legal status. They're treated as individuals. And, you know, why I'm not trying to create that as the only horizon for thinking about it, I think that this is where ontopower begins, where you have non-human, ex-human, more than human entities that are beginning to take on the status that we usually associate with humans. We're not calling them humans, but we're treating them as individuals. Right? So there is a kind of politics around that, and it's sort of messy. I'm not sure entirely what to make of it, but it does seem to me fundamentally produces, if we try to think of television as in the terms I was setting out. You know, on the one hand, television is a lot like what Foucault called psychiatric power. It has therapeutic functions. But if we begin to look at these media effects of addiction, we also see something a little bit different. So television might be associated with the biopolitical because it creates emergencies. Like all our media create emergencies all the time. They're always flashing at us and creating emergencies. But it seems to me today, one of the functions of streaming and broadcasting together is to stretch across the psychiatric and the biopolitical as if they're a form of therapy, right? That's what ontopower is, creating individuals that seem to stretch across these forms of power and make their excesses feel less harmful. But at the same time, it is a form of power, right? You're enmeshed in something new that is not a solution. If you will, it's a kind of a therapeutic solution to a problem. So in some ways, the question you're asking is, what is the power of the therapeutic today? I mean, that in some ways is the question of animism. Does the therapeutic, as it's functioning, as we're kind of training in it through media, give us a sensibility that will make us more open to the strategic animisms you're talking about, right? Through indigenous struggles. So I'm trying to think through that. I'm trying to pave a way to think, if you will, in greater detail about the knowledge power formation of contemporary media, but also think it as a problem, right? As a problematic, not simply, well, once we've grasped this, we have the solution. I'm more interested in, does this develop a new way to form connections? It seems to me ultimately, we would have to work back through precisely what you bring up in the platformative, right? We still have to contest philosophically identity, resemblance, and correlation. I mean, those are still real obstacles to thinking subjectivity and sensibility. So my terms that I'm coming up with through platformativity, semblance, and parasociality, and amodality, really, you know, those three terms are really ways of contesting the hold of identity, resemblance, correlation. So that, if you will, is the conceptual toolkit. But the attempt then is to think, once we can begin to think of media formations through ontopower, do we stage our politics differently or think about it differently? Sorry, again, a hard question, so a long answer.
Thanks, Tom. That's great.
May I?
Yes, I noticed that, yeah. Ja-hyun, you had your hand up.
Yes, nice to see you again.
Nice to see you.
Wow. Oh, I thought that I had a problem with internet connection because your speech was posing a separate time, so I missed some part. But I didn't miss, well, really main points. But you mentioned, I mean, resistance, but after that I missed some parts of your clarification in terms of resistance. But I do love that part, because maybe if I touch upon some very classical or traditional media scholars or arguments about the resistance of human subjectivity or participants, then yes, I do love your points and perspective. Well, I do have a very similar question, maybe to myself, because I'm also doing some research on media reception, if I can say, and also the interactions. And you mentioned two registers of interactions. One of them is individuals, and then the other one is individual and infra relations. That one is really fascinating to me because I'm also looking at some platform dependency. And also the other one is, I mean, the diagram that you show that the relationships between the user, maybe to me, participants or viewers, and also the contents and message, and also platform. So, well, I read, I mean, I'm not quite sure if you know Hee Kyung-jo. She also wrote the platformization of culture. So for example, her point is the high on user popularity of Korean webtoon is because of maybe this, I mean, dependency of platforms, and also the distinctive way of distributing and maybe also circulating this, I mean, the webcomics, the contents. So, but my question is maybe first, yes, we may need to pay attention to the high dependency of platform, maybe because of pandemic, because the pandemic really, you know, accelerated the social phenomenon. But the other one is when I, just to look at the, I usually focus on comments to look at how really individuals engage in the way of interactions by using this platform, but still they are really individuals, they are human beings. The platform itself, maybe, yes, we can say another way of maybe interaction ways, maybe non-human or maybe post-human or ex-human, but still inside the message who really correspond and exchange and make some discourses online is still human beings. So, but I mean, this is also my own way, maybe because I'm more care about the way how people or individuals and then users, they exchange or they develop their discourses on the way they receive this message and how they really engage in the communications or interactions. So I just wondered if you have any thought about the way people really develop or engage in developing discourses, even in this changing media environment. Yes, because I'm still, I think we need to concern the questions of individual activities or individual relationships and interactions. Even though many West scholars, they argue that yes, we live in a platform society, or platformization is really accelerated and it changes media ecology, but still, I mean, to me, it matters. So I'd like to just to hear about when you think about it. Thank you.
Yeah. No, it's a really good remark, and it made me think of one of the examples that I don't know as well, but got me interested in platformativity, and that was Korean mukbang. That is this idea of, you know, it was associated particularly with young women going home after work, living alone, and they turn on their laptop and they eat supper with some guy who eats a ton of food and makes a lot of noise, right? So when I think of a situation like that, I mean, what strikes me in terms of trying to think of what's going on with social relations is the fact that there were all these discourses of from the television era that this was wrong because young women were bringing strange men into their apartment, right? So it almost had like a moral outrage. And it's like, but it's a computer, right? So we all know this. But it pushes the point, because you realize that if we take the standpoint of the young woman who's watching mukbang, the human, the man on the screen, is becoming more like a platform. That's the attraction. Like, she doesn't want that guy in her apartment. She wants the platform version, right? So he's more like a character than, you know, so yes, he's an individual, but he's a new kind of individual. And you can argue that we accord a certain kind of respect to those individuals. Even if we treat them as platforms, we can still have certain kind of social relations with them. But that's more of the question I was trying to get to. How is it that the human is more like a platform, and you can engage with other humans more like you are a platform, and you can become a character, and your platform can become a character? So the interest for me in looking at all 3 points, as it were, was to instantly complicate the transparency of, like, we're on Zoom right now, that I'm just talking with you on Zoom, but a whole kind of set of social relations come in, even on Zoom, that we need to think about what they do, right? Rather than just assume that it's nice to make the connection, but at the same time, it's a new kind of connection. I don't know if that gets to your concern, but that's what I was thinking.
Thank you.
Andrea, you're muted.
Yeah. I know, Zoom, right? It always gets you. I wanted to kind of follow up from a slightly different direction on Chia-Yong's point. The platformativity, that term, and of course, right, the kind of play with performativity is really exciting. And I'm really interested in the question of form, right? The form in it, especially if we're thinking about translations or kind of like shifts from individuals to platforms. So if we're thinking about animism, the question here is, what is the perspective according to which we shift, say, from individual to platforms or from individuals to environments or ecosystems, right? I mean, one of the problems I find in how animism is sometimes connected to critical theory or more contemporary philosophy, say the Viveros de Castro moment, is that it seems nevertheless fairly anthropomorphic, in that we're basically integrating some desirable features from animism into something that, even if it has a Deleuzean cast, etc., right, is still a fairly individualistic or kind of Western framework. And so I'm really interested in kind of like the directions, how we make those connections, and thinking about, I feel right in your talk, the idea of semblance in particular, right, seems to get to something that's just beyond the, oh, it's the anthropomorphic, or we're just basically using our perspective and equating A and B, right? That's very clearly not what you're after. So I wanted to ask you to just maybe connect the dots for me again between platformativity, semblance, and animism, and what the preconditions for us as thinkers of media and maybe resistance are in order to not fall into, say, a trap of anthropomorphism or using indigenous concepts in a way that seem convenient, but still within a, say, Western metaphysics or post-structuralist theory framework.
Yeah, thank you, Andrea. I mean, I think that one of the things to learn from animism in terms of the way, I mean, I'll say real animism, with an understanding what I mean, that it's not really anthropomorphic or anthropocentric. I mean, there's been a lot of critiques of animism. Marshall Sahlins also, and people have critiqued Eduardo Viveros de Castro for assuming that animism is a kind of anthropomorphism of the other. But when you look at animist traditions, it's really about persons, and a person, thinking the person beyond the human. I would say that's a spot where what we think of as Western metaphysics and what we know of animist traditions, because I can't pretend to be inside them or to be an expert, but it seems to me that's a point where Western metaphysics changes, and maybe animism is in dialogue with this in a certain way. I mean, a real reductive instance of this would be something often popular in Japan, is getting married with an anime character. Now, the anime character, I would say, is really being made a person. It's not confused with a human, right? I mean, the mostly men who want to do this are really pretty categorical in refusing the idea that they're confused about what a person is or a human is. They think of the anime character as a person. And I think if we stick with something like that, we begin to see how, say with something like mukbang or even our interactions on the internet, we're often treating non-human entities as persons. Partly because we're simply engaged with image. I mean, an image of a human is not a human, right? It's something's happened. And we can treat that as a representation with resemblance, but I don't think that's really how we interact with persons in media worlds. We actually are treating things as persons. Maybe then we understand them as humans, but I would say their personness comes to the fore first. And I think that personness extends to the platform. I mean, not their platform, not like it's a human, but certainly like it's an entity that has maybe a personness to it. Even putting animation characters on it or other kinds of character goods, giving it faces and qualities and personality. So that's what interested me in platformativity. And it's also a way to get out of, I think, one of the traps we sometimes fall in with Butler's notion of performativity, where it's about remaking yourself. But the fact is, media are also remaking us. But the force of the way media remakes us doesn't have quite the normativity of what Butler's talking about, right? So I found it difficult to transfer her sense of performativity and have media as a material presence, right? Because she just has a mirror fundamentally, and the mirror disappears in performativity. Whereas when we're on Zoom or any of these platforms, the platform is not disappearing. It's acting. So does that better delineate some of the concerns?
I think absolutely it does. Thank you so much. I mean, maybe like one of the ethical considerations is then that if we're thinking about, say, personhood being extended to, say, corporations, right, that some of those shifts actually are ethically difficult or precarious, right? And so the question is how to shift between, or basically transfer personhood in a way that's in media that's ethically interesting. For the Butler, I think with the platformativity, I was more reminded of her concept of frame in Frames of War, but I find that very problematic too.
Yeah, it's a good thing to note. I mean, platformativity could be thought in relation to Heidegger's in framing, obviously. And I think that Judith Butler's framing owes something to the Heideggerian in framing. But I would say I'm trying to push that further because I think even Heidegger, like the way he thinks media and technology feels very limited for us today, because it's hard to make it into a technological condition because we're dealing with so many different kinds of things in different ways. And our knowledge and connection to them is so much different. And I'd also add for Heidegger and Butler that framing and inframing appear when things break, whereas we know we're kind of always in a situation where everything's breaking and not breaking, like right now with our Zoom interface.
At the same time, it's interesting because the delimitation of the moment of what Heidegger would call the moment of technological crisis or event does, to a certain extent, pertain to the interface that we've faced in the past year in relationship to what you're calling platformativity. So there's this strange way, sometimes I still find that liminal moment that Heidegger articulates between technology and techne to have some valence in terms of the urgency of eventfulness that these moments of technological pressure point bring upon us.
Yeah, I mean, I think that describes the Pokémon incident quite well, right? Like, But yeah, to give another example that I think is really good would be, I think everyone knows Sarah Cooper, who did those amazing versions of Trump. And that would mark for me the difference between performativity and platformativity, because she becomes a platform. I mean, she's literally not functioning as someone who's doing an imitation of Trump. She's channeling his words through her body the way a platform would. But you feel how the platform transforms what Trump is. Right. And it's incredibly profound and hilarious. I mean, I think for me, that was an instance where I could really feel platformativity as a kind of resistance.
In contrast to fat formativity. Do we have other questions for Tom? I don't see any. Tom has been incredibly generous to us today. For those of us who are the members of the EastAsia Plus Initiative community, we've had a full afternoon of talking about alternative media platforms. And Tom, I want to thank you for coming back to us virtually. We're all like teary-eyed that it's not in person because the weather's just so fantastic that we would have been able to have maybe the first outdoor celebration we've had in over a year with you, but we're celebrating with you anyway. And I know that I speak for everybody in the initiative to thank you for coming. And we're also, personally at Cornell, we're extremely thankful to our international participants, Livia, Mimi, who came, and it's been a tremendously provocative and engaging talk and call and response. So thanks to everybody who's participated.
Yeah, thank you everyone for the great questions and the opportunity. Thank you.